Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for having me here. I do not speak French. Spanish is my original language, so you will apologize any, let's go with English with a slight accent, and let's hope that this works well. So I'm going to be speaking about the gender benchmark. It's a little bit newer than the CHRV that Talia was talking about, but it follows the same principle. So it's basically a benchmark where we're trying to assess companies at scale, so all 2,000 companies that WBA is looking at, but also in depth into some more like high-risk sectors. And it's based on publicly available information and disclosure by companies. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a history, in 2021, WBA developed its first pilot of this gender benchmark that only applies to 35 apparel and kind of fashion footwear companies. And the feedback we got after that benchmark, particularly from investors and financial institutions, was, that looks great, we want to see more of it, because we cannot work with a data set of 35, we want to see data at scale. That led to us last year actually scaling this model way bigger than we were before. So now we're assessing all 2,000 companies in scope of WBA, which I will present a little bit more in a map later, in kind of these topics that you see here. And as we're going deeper into 112 apparel and food and agricultural companies, where actually we're looking not just at kind of the fundamental topics of gender equality, but looking particularly also at risks in the supply chain. The reason we focus on these two sectors is because both apparel and food and agriculture are some of the sectors where most women work in the supply chains, and some of the most salient impacts for women are taking place. So to give you an idea, for example, in the apparel sector, the fashion sector, about 60% of the women working in factories, like 60% of people working in factories are women. In some countries like, I think Vietnam, that's about 80%. So any, for example, labor issues that you may have in supply chains are affecting significantly women. So to speak to you a little bit about the methodology, as you'll see, it follows a similar principle to the corporate human rights benchmark. We're looking at governance and strategy, so basically having the company ensuring that they have a policy commitment, that they have targets, that they have someone responsible for gender equality in the company, and some of the basic elements also of just proper governance and risk management, like grievance mechanisms, like a proper due diligence process as well. And then we have these 4 topics you see here: representation, compensation and benefits, health and well-being, and violence and harassment, as some of the areas that we see with most salient risks to women. These 4 areas apply both to own operations of companies and to supply chain, as I was mentioning. And finally, we have this last element called marketplace and community, which applies only to apparel and food and agriculture, and it's looking less about companies' own operations and supply chains and more about their impact at society at large, right? So in marketplace, you're looking at marketing practices that are not reproducing stereotypes, for example, while in community, you're looking at some corporate social responsibility efforts, how they kind of providing investment in local communities, etc. These numbers you see here are basically the weighting we're giving to the scores. So just, I think sometimes people are like, what is that 17.5%? It sounds random, but it's basically because if you actually divided the 17 in 4, that's where you land. A little bit more also on the methodology itself, to give you, I think, more of a flavor of what we're looking at. Within representation, we're looking not just representation of women at the board, but also across all levels of the organization. So from C-suite, middle management, to actually the composition of the employees themselves, and also leadership in the supply chain. We have also topics of freedom of association and collective bargaining here, of professional development. Within compensation and benefits, we have gender pay gap, and then also many issues related to the unpaid care gap, so parental leave, childcare, flexible work, both again in own operations and supply chain. Health and well-being, and also information and services on gender-related issues. Violence and harassment, where we're looking not just at prevention, but also remediation processes, again, both at own operations and supply chains. And I already talked to you about marketplace and community. Unlike the CHRV, because we're a much newer benchmark, we don't have as many examples of investors using our data yet, but we know that we were created to be at scale precisely because there was a need from kind of publicly available transparent data on this topic. So 2 upcoming opportunities that kind of we would like to invite you also to consider as well. One is, as Talia mentioned, that we're launching an investor guidance that's based on the research results of our gender benchmark next week, where there's some questions on how to engage companies on this topic. So if you're thinking about working on, again, is it representation of women in leadership? Is it the care burden, parental leave, violence and harassment, any topics that you may be interested, we have some particular questions on data on what companies are doing on this issue. The other one, which is actually a bit of a spoiler alert, because this is not fully public yet, is that we're putting together a multi-stakeholder coalition with some of the allies of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which includes investors, civil society organizations, business platforms, and others, with the idea of driving change on one of the topics that the benchmark found as one of the main gaps, which is the lack of prevention and remediation of violence and harassment in global supply chains. So we're going to convene a group of stakeholders that want to drive change on this topic. We're looking at having a meeting to present this strategy in May. So if anyone is interested in hearing more about that, no commitment, no strings attached, just listening about it, please let me know so I make sure that you get an invitation to that meeting in mid-May. And also on that topic, maybe to flag that in terms of violence and harassment, besides being what I hope is a fairly intuitive topic, which is problematic, like no one should be subject to violence or to harassment in their workplace, it's also linked to a fairly new convention of the International Labour Association, Convention 190 of violence and harassment in the workplace. So what we're trying to do is accelerate this convention and the implementation of it by some of the largest companies, which have the largest numbers of women in their own operations and their supply chains. So what do we publish? Talia already kind of showed a little bit what we have in terms of scorecards and rankings. So the gender benchmark has the same. So you can go to our website, you'll see a ranking of the 112 companies that we looked in depth, but also like the data and details on all of the 1,000, sorry, I didn't say this before. So last year, we published the 112 that I mentioned, apparel and food and agriculture, but we also assessed 1,000 companies on a subset of the methodology, less detailed in supply chains, but still very much kind of detailed in the rest of the information. And this is basically what the data set looked like. I know it's a bit tiny, so again, we're going to share this, and also we'll try to share some QR codes here, so if you want to then come later and get the links, you will be able to explore Excels, if you like Excels. I feel people have mixed feelings about Excels. I kind of like them. So to kind of give you a sense, and this is what the gender benchmark data set looks like, but also our CHRV data set and the one that Talia mentioned that has data in human rights scope, which is our social data set, have a similar structure. So basically you have really transparent data where you would have the company name, region, industry, a score, which is the total score in the benchmark, but then you have on each indicator what the score is, and on a different tab that you don't see here, each one of these scores is actually explained transparently. So let's say you want now double-click in why Adidas got the point here. You go to that tab and it would be like Adidas got the point because the rationale, where's the source, so you can go to the source. So the idea is that all of the information behind the data is also available for you to use at the level of granularity you actually want to have. So yeah. Please, again, the QRs are here. We'll share the links as well, so I don't think you need to kind of play a little bit of trying to get the QR you want, but just for information. And just to go to the final slide, on what's next, so we mentioned that basically we were talking much more about the data we have at scale. So 112 food and apparel, 230 on the 5 sectors Talia mentioned, but our ambition is to go much larger. And that's when we're basically covering these 2,000 companies that we call the keystone companies, or the SDG 2000. These companies are kind of, through the model of company selection we have at WBA, have been identified as some of the most influential companies globally to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. You can actually also access the list of companies on our website. And the idea is that while last year we published the more in-depth, smaller benchmarks, by this year, we're finally actually hitting the 2,000 company mark on human rights and gender. So in July, we're going to have all of these 2,000 companies on human rights and social fundamentals. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be July around the 8th or 12th. We don't have exactly the final date, but that's kind of the week. And then on gender, that's going to be available on December. And after that, we're going to be, as Talia mentioned, publishing this every 2 years. So the next 2,000 company data set on human rights, gender, and social is going to be in 2026, 2028, and so forth. And that's it from us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.